Now that you've read this, Emily, let's talk about point of view and setting in this story. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Southern Gothic literature. Southern Gothic literature is a subset of American Gothic, but it is very different in practice. Um, Southern Gothic literature takes the elements of American Gothicism, the idea of evil, the idea of cultural anxiety, and it applies it to a specific Southern situation. But it manifests very differently. They're very different forms of Gothicism to take note of. So now, the Cask of Amontillado is an example of American Gothic, which was popularized by, among others, Edgar Allan Poe. And American Gothic really focuses on the nature of evil, and it questions the idea of whether um, creepy or paranormal or mysterious things that happen. It questions whether these sort of anxiety-inducing or fearful events are a product of insanity or evil. It asks questions about do people become evil or are they born that way? These are the things that we're looking at in American Gothic literature. Now, in Southern Gothic literature, which is a subset of that, this was popularized in the early 1900s, and it deals with a period of time following the Civil War in the South. So, 1870s or so through the early 1900s. And it takes the idea of cultural anxiety and fear that is founded in all Gothic literature, and it narrows it down to the specific issues that are going on in the South at the time. So, following the Civil War, there was a lot of change happening in the South. Enslaved people were emancipated, and that not only, changed the social dynamic, but economically, it was a lot of changes because, their infrastructure was built on the backs of free labor. It changed a lot of things as far as values were considered. And we'll get more into that here in just a bit. But these sort of anxieties that are going on during this time, not all of which are, there are many different anxieties going on at the time, is what Southern Gothic is looking at. And so it really looks at sort of the disturbing realities and moral shortcomings of a fragile social order. It looks at the uglier parts of those anxieties, whereas American Gothic is going to look at the more evil parts of those anxieties. Southern Gothic focuses on complex characters, whereas American Gothic focuses on mystery slash paranormal events. Um, Usually, the characters in Southern Gothic literature are bizarre, strange, grotesque, and whereas when we're looking at American Gothic, we're looking at like evil and insanity. So that's the key differences between the characters that are going on there. Now, keeping this in mind, let's talk about point of view and setting in Faulkner's story.
Before we get into narrator point of view, I want to ask you a question that many people have about this story, to frame some of the ideas we're going to talk about in this analysis video. Why does Emily kill Homer? What is the reason? Why is it that she kills Homer? So we also don't know why Montresor kills Fortunato, really. But we do have an idea that it's some sort of revenge. But in this story, it's much different. We don't know that she kills him until the very end, and we don't get a lot of context about it. So why does Emily kill Homer, do you? Now, before I address the answer to that question, I want to share this excerpt with you about the qualities of Southern Gothic literature. The characters in Southern Gothic literature are mostly freakish, disabled, complex, and even delusional. The grotesque and macabre is embodied in writings of the human characters who are spiritually and physically monstrous. There is a sense of moral and physical decay, as well as the acknowledgement of death as another character is always there. In Southern Gothic literature, we don't have so much as evil characters. Montresor arguably is evil or malicious. Emily, on the other hand, is not portrayed to be an evil character. She is portrayed to be a bizarre, complicated, um, uh, psychologically traumatized woman. She is portrayed to be um, grotesque in many physical ways, but she's not portrayed to be evil. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. Why does she kill Homer? What is it that leads her to that act? In the story, the narrator point of view limits how much we can answer that question. So this story can be challenging for folks to identify the point of view because we get the story from an outsider's perspective. But remember, first person narrators are inside the story. They use first person pronouns. Third person narrators are outside the story. And in the story, the narrator uses plural first person pronouns. They say, so the next day we all said, and then we said it would be the best thing. So this tells us that the narrator is internal to the story, meaning they're first person, and they use the plural we. So it's a collective that is telling the story. And the narrator is largely regarded in the story to be the town. It is the collective townspeople that are telling the story to us. Now, consider how that's going to affect the story. Essentially, the version of this story that we get is the gossip or the sort of story that the town has about Emily. We don't see much of Emily in this story at all, as a matter of fact. We only know what people in the town are saying about her. So this completely changes the perspective of the story, and this does correspond to Southern Gothic writing, the idea of isolation and outsiders. But the narrator is incredibly influential to how the story is portrayed. As far as why she kills Homer, sometimes students might think that he tries to leave her. Towards the end of the story, he kind of disappears. The narrator says, we never saw him again. And oftentimes, people can assume that that means that Homer sort of ran off on her. But in reality, the narrator doesn't actually know what has happened to Homer until Emily dies at the end of the plot time. So while the narrator, the town might have assumed that Homer had left her, we actually find out at the end that he did not leave her. He's been dead in her house this whole time, and we can't know that because of the limitations of that first person narrator. So, in reality, we can't actually know why Emily killed Homer. We can only know what the town is saying about it, but we have no insight into their relationship. We actually don't even know if the conflicts that the narrator conveys to us were really conflicts. You know, the town was sort of gossiping about how um, nobody wanted to marry her, and it was kind of pitiful for her. We don't know if she actually felt that way at all. Also notice in this first person narrator that we are limited by the first person to what the townspeople know. So for example, we only see the inside of Emily's house when the aldermen come to collect the taxes, because you have folks in the town inside the house, and at the end of the story when they go in after she's died. But the entire rest of the story, we have no idea what's going on in there. And that's because we are limited to what the townspeople know as the first person narrator. As well, the narration is going to be influenced by their bias. The town's perception of Emily is essentially her reputation. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate, and it is going to be swayed by gossip and untruths, and it's not entirely reliable. As well, some would argue that the townspeople probably might have potential guilt about this situation. You know, they knew that Emily was in the house all alone. They knew that she had a hard time, and nobody did anything. And there was an argument to be made that once they find out what had actually happened, there might be a sense of sort of guilt or trying to absolve themselves of responsibility. Uh, there's also an argument to be made that that's why it's a collective narrator rather than a single person, as a way of sort of deflecting blame from any individual. Now, this story's temporal setting, or this story's setting in general, is incredibly complex. Uh, and there's a lot about the setting that influences the story within the Southern Gothic tradition. So plot time is when the action takes place, and the plot time of this story is essentially Emily's life. You know, we get moments in time for when she is a young woman living with her father. We get moments in her life throughout the rest of her adulthood until you know, the shift before and after the taxes, and then finally to her death. So sort of the span of her life. However, the narrator time is different. From the first line of the story, it mentions Emily's funeral. So when the narrator, the people of the town, are telling us their story, Emily has already died. The narrator is somewhere in the future, and they are telling the story through flashbacks and through reflections in sort of retrospect over a period of time that has happened in the past. The author time is also important to this story. So the story was published in the 30s, and that's when we can assume that William Faulkner wrote it. And this period of time had its a specific set of issues going on that are directly connected to some of the themes in the story that we'll get into in a bit. And then the reader time, that is when we're reading it in 2023. I need to update that, but in 2023, and that affects the story in a lot of ways. Now, when William Faulkner was writing this story, in 1930. This was the era of segregation. This is also just after the Great Depression. As well, this was a period of time in the South where the question of whether, the question of race and the question of whether society was going to integrate was on people's minds, and Faulkner wrote about it at the time. A lot of Southerners were hesitant to integrate, public places and schools because of racist reasons, but a lot of Southerners were actually hesitant to integrate public places because, they felt that the South had gone through a lot of change in in a span of 50 years. After the Civil War, the South was economically devastated. They had built, their society on free labor from enslaved people, and they no longer had that. They had also, had a lot of economic cost in the war. So you had this sort of, plantation culture, this of wealth and this antebellum period of like almost the glory days of the old South is how some Southerners portrayed it, and that changed very rapidly after the Civil War. And as people start talking about integration, one thing that Faulkner and other people in the South were writing about at the time was that it was too much change too fast. So it wasn't necessarily, they weren't necessarily using the reason of racism directly, but they would say things like, we need to give people time to adjust. We need to give people time to adjust to this new period. We need to slow things down. And that is something that comes up in the story. The story also refers to the war, that is the Civil War that they are referring to. So Emily lives in a big estate, and it talks about how it is decaying, and it once used to be this great thing, and it's no longer. The implication is that Emily's family was owned a plantation, that they owned enslaved people. Toby most likely was a former slave that remained in Emily's employ. And now after the Civil War, the her whole family's wealth or estate has been eliminated, and the world is changing around her, and that's an important part of what's going on in the story. What was going on in the story immediately after the Civil War, and what was going on in the author time in 1930. So, in the South, spanning this period of time from around the Civil War to her death, what are those social and cultural fears that are going on during this period? Well, the Civil War and emancipation had led to the devastation of the Southern plantation culture, and this led to many people romanticizing and reminiscing about the good old days, or what is known as the Old South. Emily is an emblem of the Old South. Her mansion is a symbol of the Old South. And you'll see Emily is, she's portrayed in this sort of unflattering, gross sort of way, and the house is decaying. Lost its stature, and this is symbolic of how the Old South is dying out, and it's giving way to this movement called the New South. This New South um, of innovation and some degree of greater equity. And there were a lot of people in the South that were very hesitant and very resistant to that change. Emily, however, clings to the Old South almost to a point of delusion. So when the aldermen come to collect her taxes, she says, "No, go talk to, this person," and that person's dead. So we can tell that she's so stuck in the past, and she refuses to change. She refuses all of these changes so much that that she's delusional to an extent. Henry Grady was a member of the New South movement, and he wrote in 1886, which would have been roughly, throughout Emily's life, that there was a South of slavery and secession, and that South is dead. And Emily essentially refuses to accept that the South of the Old South is dead. A particular setting in the story is a house. And as I mentioned, you see the house decaying. The house is this sort of, monument, or this stature from her family, and it's in disrepair. It's falling apart, and that is symbolic of how, the old plantation culture has fallen apart following the Civil War. And if you remember back to the author time, this is also connected to how now there's this other big social shift, or social push for integration after the Civil War. So these things are sort of um, parallel to each other and have connections to each other throughout the setting. Something that we can't read the story without talking about is its treatment of race. Now, reader time is when we're reading it. When this story was published in the 1930s, this was the height of Jim Crow. This was the height of lynching and racial violence. This was a very dangerous time to be a person of color in the South, and this was a time when, a lot of the values of people in all parts of the country, but particularly in the South, were very dehumanizing and racist towards people of color, and you absolutely see that in the representation of Toby. He is treated as a caricature of a black man. He is also uh, they use language to refer to him that doesn't sit well with people in 2023, and rightfully so. And this is something to keep in mind about this story. When this was published, the way that they talk about Toby was completely commonplace. And when we read that in reader time in 2023, it's hard for a lot of people to stomach, and that's absolutely fair. Now, as for what do we do with the details of this story, some folks are able to sort of see it through, that was just the period of time, and that was how the world was at that period of time, and that's fine. And other folks say no, we can't. It doesn't matter. We still can't excuse it today, and that's also okay. How you do the math on this in reader time is up to you, and it's not up to me to tell you how to do that. But this is why the different sort of time frames related to this story can dramatically influence the way that we read it. Now, most readers can pick up on the fact that this was a more racially charged, or racially conflicted period of time, simply based on the language that is used in it. But remember that in setting, there are also details about the setting that are going to depend on how much you know about that particular point in time. So there is a quote in the story that says, "Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894, when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no black woman should appear on the streets without an apron." And they use a different word, but it's inappropriate to use an MLA in 2023. So they refer to this law that black women could be arrested for wearing an apron on the streets. And this is actually a reference to the historical setting. It's a reference to something known as the Black Codes. These were laws that were passed to limit the freedom of newly emancipated African Americans. The 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that abolished slavery, and involuntary servitude, the language of that amendment actually said that nobody could be enslaved except as punishment for a crime. So this led to some southern municipalities and cities making laws against very random things like wearing an apron in order to, subjugate black southerners and put them back into forced labor. The Sartoris family as well. This is another layer that, if it's not in your knowledge, it's going to slip past you. The Sartoris family actually shows up in many of Faulkner's novels, and Colonel Sartoris, who he refers to in this passage, is a Klan leader. He's a member of the KKK. So these are these sort of details that you might not access on your first read, but as you're thinking about the story and picking up on these things, these are elements of the setting to analyze and think about what they tell us about what's going on. So, what does it all mean? The title of the story is A Rose for Emily, and Faulkner wrote famously that the intention behind the title was that he wanted to pay homage or give a tribute to Emily. He wanted to offer a rose to Emily. Now, Emily, as we've mentioned, represents this Old South mentality, this refusal to change. And what we're supposed to do with that as readers is open to interpretation. So one reading is that Emily is portrayed in a very grotesque way. She's, they talk about how her eyes look like coal and she's sort of fat and squatty. And some people say that this rose that he's giving her is actually pitying her or feeling sorry for her or revealing the sort of perverseness of that mentality. Another interpretation is that it's exposing the problems with her generation and what she represents. So it's, paying tribute to these people who are refusing to keep up with the times in a social way. And another reading is that the story glorifies and reminisces about the old South. So the idea that he's paying tribute to Emily when Emily represents a period of time that involves slavery, that her family owned, enslaved people. To give her a rose, some readers say that that is a way of glorifying and reminiscing about, this ugly period of time, or that the story is defending white Southerners who wanted to cling to this era. So it's sort of, um, comforting or sort of absolving these white Southerners of their hesitance to get with the times. Now, what do you think? Does this story pay tribute to a tragic heroine or show sympathy to those who cling to the bygone South? Does it illustrate the perverseness of the South? This story can be there are a lot of different ways to take this story, and some people think that this story is highly problematic in 2023, and there absolutely are elements that are. And others think that this story is a way uh, uh, of sort of admitting the shame of that period. And as to how you are going to draw that conclusion, that's up to you. But these are things to think about when we're using setting to analyze the meaning behind a story.